Hello, my name is Harzing, and today we'll be talking about doing a literature review. Doing a literature review is a little bit like having two jobs. First of all, you're looking for literature, you're like a detective finding the evidence, and then you're writing up your literature review. So you're a bit like a lawyer arguing the case. In this session, we'll go through a lot of different steps that are important in doing a literature review. We'll look at information management strategies, at the role of a literature review. We'll look in detail at the various sources of literature and the ways you can keep current. We'll also talk about how to decide when you can stop and what are the different types of papers that you might come across. We'll also look at how to evaluate the literature to ensure that you only keep the literature that's relevant. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about how to write up the literature review in your thesis and how this will be evaluated. Okay, first step, information management strategies. Where do you even start? There is so much information available. If we look at information management strategies, your challenge is very different from what my challenge was during my PhD. I completed my PhD before the internet was even available. So my challenge really was to get access to information and find the time to do so. Oftentimes this involved traveling to various libraries across the country. Your challenge is really to manage the wealth of information you have easy access to, but not to waste too much time on completely irrelevant information. In order to help you with this, it's really important that you are organized and systematic in your approach to research. This might involve a lot of different things. First of all, keeping a research log, where you list the keywords, the search strategies that were particularly successful and unsuccessful, notes about index and databases that are particularly useful. Going back to search strategies is always much more time consuming. Then in this process, never assume that you will remember what you've done. Most of us really seriously overestimate our own ability to retrace our steps. Remember, you might think you're only having a couple of hours break or a 1 day break in your work, but it might well turn out into a week, a month, or even months. And then you will have completely forgotten all the strategies that you so carefully devised. In keeping all these references, consider using EndNote or other reference management software to make sure you can keep track of all the literature. Then finally, make sure that you keep track of everything you find. Things that you find are not relevant for your particular project at this stage might become very relevant to other projects later on. So keep folders where you keep all the relevant literature. And then finally, allow time to locate the best resources. Successful search strategies are often fine-tuned quite a number of times, and finding full text can take a lot of time as well. Although these days, interlibrary loads are amazingly quick. Okay, step 2. How does the literature review fit in the entire project? So how does it fit in the entire cycle of doing empirical research? Here you will find the whole cycle of empirical research. So we start out with some questions about what's happening in the real world, and from those we formulate a kind of a problem that we would like to investigate. We then try to find some theories that might explain this problem in preliminary terms, and then design a study to figure out what else might explain this particular problem. We then design a particular operational plan, the research methods, and we conduct some observations about the real world through whatever methods you have chosen. Then we collect data and variables, and we embark on some sort of analysis of these, and then come to conclusions about the real world again. So where do you think the literature review fits into all of this? Well, I guess you'll say theory, absolutely. But where else? Are there any other aspects of the total research projects where you think the literature review might be helpful? I'll give you a bit of time to think about this. Okay, so how many different parts of the total research project do you think the literature review would fit in? One, the theory we've already identified. Any others? Okay, let's look at the next slide. So, no less than 6 areas in which a literature review might be important. How many did you pick? I bet some of you picked 6, but I suspect many of you only picked 2 or 3. So let's look in a little bit more detail in how the literature review fits into these different elements of the empirical research cycle. So first of all, selecting a topic. You can select a topic based on your observations of the real world, but you can also select a topic by reading either the popular or the academic literature. You might identify some topics that are of interest to you, and in that process, you might also identify some theories and what we call research gaps, areas that have not been studied yet. From those, you end up formulating research questions and possibly even hypotheses if you're doing more quantitatively oriented research. So then you also use the literature review for your research strategy and research methods. You might want to use the literature to support a frequently used research approach and say you're actually going to use this same research approach, or you might actually say, well, everyone has used this particular approach, so I'm going to study this particular problem using a really new approach. For instance, using experiments when previous research has mainly focused on interviews or survey methods. But then even if you're going to do the analysis after you've collected your data, you might refer to the literature to find examples on how to do particular analysis. You might even try to find a model article that you can follow in doing your own analysis. And then finally, of course, when you write up your discussion section of your thesis, you compare your results to the previous literature. So again, you go back to the literature. So literature review is incredibly important in many different phases of the research project. So then on to the next step. We've realized how important a literature review is in various stages of the research project, but how do you go about finding the literature? What are the different sources of literature that you can refer to? Well, first of all, if we look at the sources of literature that are available, books are a very good source. Middlesex University has a very good book collection, some of them e-books, some of them print books. If there are any gaps and you can't find the books you are after, you can go for interlibrary loans or simply use Google Books, which in many cases has a substantial part of the book online. You will find that in many cases, books are seminal works and they offer a much broader canvas than an article. And this is only logical because a book might have anywhere between 100 and 500 pages, where an article typically only is between 10 and 20 pages, so much more limited in scope. You can also look at edited books. Edited books on a particular topic, if this is the topic of your research, can provide a very useful overview from many different sources and many different authors and often many different contexts. But be careful because the quality of individual contributions might vary quite dramatically. So also look at the publishers of the book to get a sense of the quality of the book overall and the quality of the editing process. Then obviously journals are a big source of literature in most of the social sciences. So use the library to do a catalog search and a search for particular journals that in many cases your supervisor might have recommended to you. Again, if you can't find the journal in question, then simply use interlibrary loans. They are very quick these days. However, in addition to books and journals, there are also other sources. You might look at government and industry sources. I actually have a very useful list of links on my website. And for instance, if you're working in international business, the UNCTAD World Investment Report provides a wealth of statistics on international trade and investment. But this might be the case in any area of business and management and economics. Then obviously there's the internet, source of a vast amount of information, but as we all know, anyone can put anything on the web. So be careful and make sure that you actually source academic literature. However, there are a number of sources on the internet, such as Google Scholar, Microsoft Academic, Crossref, all databases, all sources of data that can be very useful sources of academic work going beyond the library catalog. Then finally, and we'll talk about this a bit more in the next couple of slides, look at working papers or conference papers. These are incredibly important because you might not realize this, but by the time a paper or a book is published, the research included in it might actually be 3 to sometimes even 10 years old. That might sound incredible, but yes, the delays in doing and writing up the research and then the whole publication process are such that anything you read in a journal article or a book is already out of date in a sense. So now we know that books and journal articles might not be the most up-to-date source of information. What are we looking at to get the most up-to-date research? Well, first of all, working papers and what we call preprints. They're also sometimes called research papers or discussion papers. These are in fact drafts forms of papers that are intended for ultimate publication in journal articles, but they usually contain more detailed source data than is available in published form, so they are especially useful for PhD students. They are really important in economics, and many economists will publish working papers on sources such as SFRN or REPEC. Google Scholar is a data source that actually covers working papers as well. So if you search in Google Scholar, you will also find working papers and thus find the most up-to-date research. Many academics also include preprints of accepted papers on, for instance, ResearchGate or their own website. And these are usually papers that are already accepted for journals, but haven't really been published in print yet. If you go to the slides for this session, you can click on the link and you can see how I do this on my own website. But many academics do this on ResearchGate. So ResearchGate is a really good source of working papers and preprints as well. So the second source of really up-to-date research is conference papers. They are really a crucial source of information. And I actually cannot stress this enough, because someone might be working on exactly the same topic as you are in your PhD and might in fact preempt your work. And academic research these days is incredibly global. So saying, sorry, but I didn't know about this research will not impress the reviewers or your examiners. It doesn't mean they will fail your thesis, but at the very least, they will ask you in the revisions to incorporate this work in your final version and explain how your work adds to this. So knowing about these sources in advance is a big advantage. So you don't want to do this at the stage of submission or after your viva. So what I would do is I would identify maybe the 3 or 4 key conferences in your field. You can obviously ask your supervisors for tips on this and try and attend at least one of these every year. Obviously, it makes sense to maybe try different ones in the first and the second and the third year of your PhD. These days, you're very lucky in that many conferences are now available virtually. So you can attend conferences even if you're not able to travel to the destination, which obviously is quite time consuming and costly. So for the conferences that you cannot go to yourself, try and get access to the conference proceedings. You might want to ask maybe a colleague who has gone to the conference, ask your supervisors. If you cannot get access to the proceedings, and oftentimes they're also available online, but sometimes only for the people who've actually registered for the conference. So find someone who's actually attended the conference. But if you cannot find the papers through any of these avenues, then simply write to the authors of the paper and ask whether they are willing to share the conference paper with you. Some of them might never even respond. Others might say, I'd rather not because we're still working on the paper. But you can always try. If you don't ask, you don't get. So we've gone through the first three steps: information management strategies, the role of the literature review in the entire research project, sources of literature. But now, what do you do when you actually want to do a literature review? What do you do when you search for particular articles or books? Obviously, you can use the university library catalog, but there are other ways to do this as well. And this is what I want to talk about right now. Okay, so if you're doing a literature review, I very much recommend you to use Publish or Perish. Publish or Perish is a free software program that I've been offering since 2006. It is primarily used to do citation analysis for instance, job applications, tenure applications, but you can also use it to do a literature review. It provides you with access to 7 different data sources. They include Google Scholar, Microsoft Academic, PubMed if you're working in the medical sciences, Crossref, Google Scholar citation profiles, but also the Web of Science and Scopus, although only if your university actually subscribes to these sources. Publish or Perish is really handy because it allows you to easily keep track of all the searches you've done and to periodically repeat them. So you might have discovered a particular good search strategy and then you can repeat them just before, for instance, you're writing up the chapter or before you're submitting your thesis to figure out whether there's any new research in the area. It also allows you to do very complex searches. So to, for instance, only search for particular years or search within particular journals or particular disciplines. So what I would like you to do before the session is to install the software and just play with it a little so that during the session we can run some searches and I can answer your questions based on the type of searches that you actually want to run. Just search for Publish or Perish in Google and you'll find it instantly. It only takes 90 seconds to install it and it runs on both Windows and Mac. Just make sure you download the right version. So make sure you have this on your computer before the session. Okay, so now we know how to get access to various data sources and how to actually do a literature review. But how do you make sure you keep current, you keep up to date with all the new information that's constantly coming online? I've written up a full blog post about this. So if you go to the slides, just click on it and read the blog post. If you have any questions about this post, just make a note and we'll go through them in the session. But most of all, the important thing is to build in redundancy. Don't just rely on one particular method to keep current. One method I use very frequently and I think is very, very useful is Google Scholar alerts. And we'll look in the session at how to define these alerts. But if you're already using Scholar, try and explore a little bit before the session. You can create alerts to particular authors in your field. If there is a very important author in your field that has published a lot, just create alerts for their work. You might also do a particular keyword search and want to set up an alert for that. And you can also use Google Scholar's recommended articles feature. I wouldn't do that every day, but maybe log in once a month or so and see what the recommended articles are. I find that they're usually very useful, and in most cases, I want to look at least a third of the articles that Google Scholar recommends. Again, I've written up a bit more detail on Google Scholar and Google Scholar profiles in a blog post. So if you go to the slides and follow the link, you can read that blog post as well. And again, if you have any questions, please make a note and we'll go through those in the session. Another thing that I do, and which I find very useful, it's a more traditional way of keeping up to date, and that's subscribing to table of content alerts of journals. You can do that through the Web of Science, but there are many databases where you can do this. So most journals have a new issue every month, every 2 months, or every 3 months. So what I do is every 3 months, I just go through all of the journals that I think are important in my field and go through the table of contents systematically. But in between, I have the alerts. So they come into my inbox, my email inbox, and if there is an article that I'm particularly excited about, I can follow up on this in between the 3 months systematic searches. There might be other ways to do this. So if you've used any particular strategies in the past that you found really helpful, just make a note of them and prepare to share them in the session. So with all of this information, the question obviously is, how much is enough? When can I actually stop doing my literature review? Well, as we've said before, you can never really stop because there's always new information coming on. But if you do your first literature review to establish the topic and to establish the research gap in the field, what ballpark are we looking at, and when do you know to stop? So in deciding how much is enough, focus and relevance are really the key words. So what I suggest you do is create what I call a relevance tree. You identify relevant issues or theories in your study and you visually represent how they relate to each other. So for instance, are some issues subcategories of other issues? Are some theories clearly related to each other or opposed to each other? So make sure you cover all of those in a relevance tree, and then identify how much information you have on each of the individual issues and where you're still lacking full information. Then, of course, it's always handy to have a bit of a ballpark. Obviously, we can never say you need to have a specific number of references, but I would say in general, 200 to 400 references in your thesis should be enough. It's important to be comprehensive, but not exhaustive. Nobody wants to go through a whole swath of literature that is not really that relevant. It can be extremely exhausting to be exhaustive. So don't go to 700 or 1,000. I once had a PhD student who couldn't stop reviewing the literature. I think it was partly because she was afraid to actually go into the field and collect data. And at one stage, she looked at over 1,200 references, which I think is clearly way too much. It's important to focus on relevance, and we'll go through a bit more on how to do that in later sections of today's session. But don't forget that a literature review also covers the methodology and the analysis. So it's not just about defining the problem and reviewing what others have done, but also on substantiating your methodology and substantiating your analysis. Then on a smaller scale, you can also ask yourself how many references you need to support a particular argument. If you make a particular argument in a paragraph or a sentence, do you need 1 reference, 2, 3, 4, 20? Again, I've written up a blog post on this with some guidelines. So again, I would recommend you go to the slides, read the blog post, and come back with any questions you might have in the session. Then once you've found all of this information, sometimes it's really hard to condense it to convey how this all relates to your thesis. So one way to do this is to, for instance, use tables to summarize studies. And you won't be able to read what it says here. I suspect you won't be able to read what it says here. But it basically gives the authors an indicating whether a study is empirical or conceptual, what the sample was for the study, whether whether the hypotheses in the study were confirmed or not, the variables that were included in the study, and then the specific content. In this case, it was about typologies of multinational corporations. So I indicated which type of multinational corporation they found in this particular study. And you can see that many of them found 3 of the 4, but some only found 2, and others found 4 different typologies. These kind of summaries are really time consuming to do. So make sure that you figure out whether there's any other studies that have already done so. This particular table, I had just finished creating this. And then a few weeks after this, I discovered an article that had actually done virtually the same. So I could have saved myself a lot of time starting out with that particular article and then finding out whether there were any other studies in this field. And that's something we'll look at step 6 as well. So once you've done your literature review and you have a whole pile of information, well, obviously not literally a pile, because you probably won't print the articles like I did before the internet, but you have a whole host of information. You will find that within this set of articles, there are different types of papers, and this is what we'll discuss in step 6. So there are several key types of papers. First of all, the review papers. They review all of the literature to date in a particular area. As I mentioned just before in step 5, I spent a month reviewing the literature on typologies of multinational corporations and then found a paper that had done exactly the same. So it's really worth your while to try and find review papers. They will save you an enormous amount of time. So try to find the key outlets in your field that actually publish review papers, because many journals only publish empirical papers, so papers where there's actually done empirical data collection. Review papers only review the literature, so there's no empirical data collection. Find the key outlets in your field. In my field, for instance, they are the International Journal of Management Review, the Academy of Management Annals, but there are different sources in different subdisciplines of business and management and economics. So talk to your supervisor and figure out what the key sources are in your field. So review papers, very, very important. Then the second type of papers are what I have called star papers. Star papers are papers that are cited repeatedly. That means that other authors have found these papers particularly useful in their own research. Star papers are often review papers because review papers tend to be cited quite frequently, but not always. Again, you can ask your supervisor whether he or she is aware of particular important papers in your field, the papers that everyone wants to cite. But you can also use publish or perish to do this. In order to do this, you look at the total number of citations, but you can also look at the number of citations per year, because obviously journal articles that are older will have more citations than journal articles that are younger. So journal articles that have only been published 2 or 3 years ago, but already have a lot of citations, are what we call hot papers. These are papers who've really stumbled upon a topic that's really important. So when you do some trial searches in Publish or Perish, also try and find the column citations per year. I'll show you how to do this if you haven't figured it out in the session. Then in addition to review papers and star papers, there are also what we call model papers. Papers that can be used as a template really for anything. You might use them as a template for how to write a good introduction, especially in journal articles, but possibly even in your thesis. Although in your thesis, the introduction will obviously be a lot longer than in a journal article. You can use model papers for particular research strategies, so the type of research design you'll be using. You can use model papers to establish how to do a particular analysis, which steps you need to do in the analysis, and how to report on them. You can even use model papers to write up the limitations of your study, because there's a particular set of limitations that comes back in most empirical papers. So again, try and identify papers that are really good papers and that do all of these things really well. So you might have one article that does all of these things really well, or you might have a set of articles, some that do the introduction session really well, others that do the analysis really well, and yet others that do the limitation section really well. So then step 7, one of the last steps, evaluating the literature. You have accumulated all of this literature. How to evaluate whether it's actually useful for your thesis or not. That's what we'll go through in step 7. So when you evaluate the literature, first of all, you look at coverage. Does the literature cover what you actually hope it does? So there are 7 criteria that you would look at. First of all, relevance. Is the subject actually relevant to your study? You might have thought it was relevant when you first found the article, but once you've refined your study, you might decide that this is actually not essential, so you put it aside. Then currency, is it up to date? Obviously, you shouldn't just look at articles published in the last couple of years, but if you're looking at an issue that's particularly topical, then it doesn't make sense to have lots of references that are 20 or 30 years old. So is it as up to date as needed for the topic in question? Then reliability. Is the author of the article or is the journal in which the article was published credible? In terms of the author, you might not always know unless you know from your preliminary discussions with your supervisors or other people working in the field that these are key authors in this field. But for journals, you have a bit more guidance because you can assess the quality level of the journal. And the higher the quality level of the journal, the more likely that the article is reliable. So you might have heard of journal impact factors, you might have heard of Schemago rankings, you might have heard of the ABS, the Association of Business Schools journal ranking list. There are lots of different ways to evaluate the quality of a journal. If you have any questions on this, let me know during the session, but this is really not difficult to find. Then the audience. What is the audience that it is intended for? Is it intended for an academic audience? Is it intended for a practitioner audience? Is it intended for a lay audience? So even for people who know nothing about the field. In most cases, the audience will be academic because you've looked at academic journals, but there are some journals that are what we call bridge journals. So they basically discuss academic work, but they also try to make it accessible to practitioners. In some cases, that means that you do not have enough detail in the article for it to be useful for your studies. But in other cases, it might be very useful as a sort of frame setting for your thesis. But again, it's important to be aware of this, to be aware of what the intended audience of the article is. Then once you've sifted through the articles and books according to these steps, then go through the remaining sets by initially reading all of them. And for the first 4 steps, you don't really need to read the entire article. You can look at the abstracts, the conclusion, when it was published, you look at the journal, the audience, you get a sense of that quite quickly when you look at the methodology section. So you're not actually reading every article from start to finish in the first 4 steps, but in the last 3 steps you do this. So reading the article, do you think it's accurate? Do you think the information in the article is correct? If there are any key facts in the article, try and use other sources to verify these facts. This is what we call triangulation. In addition to that, does it have the level of detail you need? Is the scope sufficient for your study? It doesn't obviously make sense if for instance, you are looking at a particular phenomenon on a worldwide or a European scale, or you look at it for the whole of Asia or Latin America or Africa, and you're dealing with a study that looks at one particular country. The scope of that study might not be broad enough. Although, if you combine it with other studies in the same region for different countries, you might be able to build up a broader picture. Then finally, objectivity. Are different viewpoints taking into account? Academic writing is balanced writing. It's not about arguing a particular point of view. That is more like journalistic or political writing. So you're looking for authors who also signal the limitations of their study, authors that also point to possible alternative interpretations of their findings. This is really hard to do if you're just starting out, but you'll get better at this as you go along. And as you probably have already guessed, points 3 to 7, so reliability, audience, accuracy, scope, and objectivity, are usually implicitly fulfilled if you use academic journals, because we would all expect these factors to be present in academic journals, but be aware that not all journals are equally rigorously reviewed. So if you have lower quality journals, the standards might be much lower, and not all of these issues might have been systematically checked in the review process. So that's evaluating literature in terms of coverage. Then, if you're actually going to use the literature in your thesis to reference, there are ways you can evaluate whether the referencing has been done correctly. And these are actually 12 steps that I've outlined in an article I published in 2002, where I showed that even many academics, established academics, aren't doing this correctly. I've called it, are our referencing errors undermining our scholarship and credibility? I studied it in the case of expatriate failure rates in the area of international HRM, but referencing errors happen, unfortunately, in any discipline. So we'll go through an example to show you what can go wrong if you reference a particular work badly. So let's assume that we have an article that's published by a particular Mr. or Mrs. Smith or Professor Smith in the Academy of Management Journal, and that contains the following statements. Studies have shown that 2/3 of the international mergers and acquisitions fail, with 3 references following the statement. That's quite common. It's often 3 references, and we've talked about this in how many references are enough. So there's nothing wrong with this particular statement. But now you are going to use this in your own study. You are going to use this information in your own study. So how you should not do this is, say, for instance, Smith has shown that 2/3 of the international mergers and acquisitions fail. Why not? Because Smith hasn't actually done this. Smith hasn't actually done a study that showed this. Smith had just referred to 3 other authors that have done studies on this. What you also cannot do, and this might be very, very tempting, and I know that lots of people do this, but it's still not good practice. What you also shouldn't do is say 2/3 of the international mergers and acquisitions fail and put the references in. So literally using the same statement as Smith has done. First of all, if you use the exact same statement, that's plagiarism. But even if you reformulate it a little and then use the same references, that's still not all right. Unless you've gone back to all 3 references yourself and verified that this information is actually in these articles. Because otherwise you're relying completely on Smith to establish that this information is actually correct. And you don't know whether Smith has actually looked at all of these references herself or himself. So, as I said before, you shouldn't use second-hand references. So use the references that someone else has found. But there might be other things that can go wrong with this. Let's assume this is a 2005 article, as I said, and you're using it in your thesis in 2020. Then are references in 1982 and 1990 still relevant? They might already have been a bit old in 2005, but in 2020, they are really old. So can we still be sure that 2/3 of international mergers and acquisitions fail in 2020? Maybe they're far less, or maybe they're more, but you don't know until you look at more recent evidence. Then are these 3 references actually reliable sources? Remember, we went through these 7 steps and reliability was an important one of them. Are these reliable sources? They are probably reliable sources if they come from other academic journals, but in some cases you might find that the reference actually refers to a magazine article or even a newspaper article, which we wouldn't consider reliable enough to use in academic writing. Then, are these references actually generalizable? Is the scope significant enough? And we've talked about this in the 7 steps as well, scope. So if these references, for instance, were all in one particular country, if all of these references only looked at, for instance, US multinational corporations or British multinational corporations or Tanzanian multinational corporations or Chinese multinational corporations, it doesn't matter what country it is, but if they only looked at multinational corporations from one particular country, you don't know whether this is valid for multinational corporations all over the world. Or if they only looked at multinational corporations in one particular industry, you don't know whether it's true in other industries. Or if they only looked at multinational corporations operating in one particular host country, you don't know whether it's relevant in other host countries. So the scope of the reference also needs to be sufficient to be able to draw a generalized conclusion. Then also be aware that if people are using these second-hand references, then the next person might maybe remove one of the references and put one instead, or might remove all of the references, and I might simply say 2/3 of the multinational corporations, 2/3 of the mergers and acquisitions fail, and leave out the international. So you've suddenly changed it from international mergers and acquisitions to all mergers and acquisitions, even if they happen within the same country. It's an easy mistake to make, but it completely changes the statement you make. And then finally, what can also go wrong, and that might be going wrong in the very first step, is being too impressed by top journals. The Academy of Management Journal is one of the top 3 journals in the field of management. So we would normally expect that articles that are published in these journals are top quality articles. That's generally the case, absolutely, but it doesn't mean that every single reference in that article is necessarily top-notch. Even publications in top journals might occasionally include things that are not quite as they should be. So don't think just because an article has been published in a top journal that every single word in that article can be relied upon. I'm not saying that you can't rely on the article as a whole, but don't just assume that every single reference is okay, because the article might well contain 200 references and you don't know whether the author has checked every single reference themselves, even though we all know we should. Okay, then nearly there, step 8, although I actually forgot to include the number in this slide, the literature review in your thesis. I won't be going through all of the steps in actually writing the literature review. I hope there will be another session in the coursework on this, but I will be covering some basics. So in terms of the literature review of your thesis, what should it do? Well, first of all, it should synthesize and classify prior literature in the field. So you provide a context for your own project by showing the universe of existing research in the field, and you position your own project in that field. The emphasis, though, is on synthesis and classification. So you don't provide a long analysis of all the literature, you synthesize and classify. In doing so, you critically appraise previous literature in the field. So you say what has been done, what has not been done. This doesn't mean that you summarize every paragraph by paragraph, every study there is. No, you do it in an integrated fashion. As I said, synthesize and classify. You then apply the literature to your research question. You indicate very clearly what has been done in prior research and what it is what you do in your own study. So you identify what we call the research gap, transforming what is already known into something that is new and interesting that you are going to research in your own study. And if you want to know a little bit more about what examiners are looking for in your thesis, there's a handy reference here. So what your literature review should not be like, and sometimes it's easier to see what you should be doing if you know what you should not be doing. It shouldn't be like the literature reviews you did in your undergraduate or master thesis. I'm not saying all of us did this, but many undergraduate and master students, they just go through the books and journals until they find a paragraph that looks sort of relevant, and then copy it and rephrase it slightly. And then if you find something in the literature that didn't really fit with what you were trying to do, you just ignore it. That's really just journalism. You pick the bits and pieces that support your argument and you ignore the rest. No, in a PhD thesis, in a doctoral thesis, you really need to have an overview of all the primary studies that analyzes in a systematic way what is known and what is not yet known. So again, it's systematic, it's not journalistic. So why is a good literature review really important? Not just for your thesis, but in particular when you're going to write up articles from your thesis and try to publish these in journals. If we look at the reasons for why articles that are submitted to a journal are rejected, we see that the literature review plays quite an important role, because the second most important reason why an article gets rejected after methodological flaws is failing to indicate the significance of the problem, not answering the so what question. Why is this issue important? Well, if you've done your literature review properly, you are able to articulate that significance. And then more than half of the manuscripts that were rejected because of the literature review section of the paper, because it wasn't comprehensive enough, because it wasn't well written, because it was out of date. There might be lots of reasons for why the literature review section wasn't appropriate, but that is a key reason. And it's much more important than some other sections, such as the conclusion section or the discussion section, because these sections are sections that can be fixed in later stages of the revise and resubmit process. But the literature review process is really crucial to show that you know the area. So what are the key problems with literature reviews? So why are papers rejected for a faulty literature review? Again, as we talked about before, it's really important to place your study in a broader context. So what is known about this research? What is the universe of research in this particular field? And how does your project fit in this broader context? How does your project add something to the stock of knowledge? How does your project teach us something that we didn't yet know? Then the second most important problem with the literature review is the failure to establish a theoretical framework. We don't need necessarily a theoretical framework in every article. Some articles work in a very inductive way. Qualitative research often works in an inductive way, and then you do not have a theoretical framework to start with, but you induce the theoretical framework from your data. But many quantitative studies would have a theoretical framework to guide their discussion. So it's not enough to simply summarize individual studies. You also need to integrate them into a coherent theoretical framework. So how is your literature review in your thesis evaluated? If we look at your literature review with the eyes of an examiner, what are the criteria that an examiner looks at? Well, first of all, coverage, and we've discussed this quite a lot already in this session. The extent to which you find and include the relevant literature, and how you've decided what is relevant. But if you've gone through the 7 steps we identified earlier, it shouldn't be difficult to do this. Then, and again, we've talked about this before, synthesis. How well do you summarize, analyze, and synthesize selected literature rather than just mention it one article after another? You really need to provide a synthesis of the most important findings. Then the methodology. How well have you identified the main methodologies and research techniques in the field and analyzed their advantages and disadvantages before deciding what methodology you are going to use in your own study? So remember, going back to the beginning of this presentation, you use a literature review not just to define the problem, not just to find a theoretical framework, but also to make decisions about research design and research methods. Then significance. How well do you discuss the practical and scholarly significance of the research problem? It's not enough to say I have studied all of this literature and there is a gap. Nobody has studied this particular topic before. That might well be true, but maybe nobody has studied it before because it's completely insignificant. Um, I once read an editorial by an editor who was so fed up with people just talking about the research gap and this hasn't been studied before, that he wrote a whole article about the build-up of fluff in his belly button because he reasoned that nobody had ever studied the build-up of fluff in his belly button. Sure, nobody had, but obviously nobody had because it was a completely insignificant and uninteresting problem. Well, it might have been interesting to the one individual, but certainly not to the academic community. So don't just try and identify a research gap, but also identify why this is important, why this is significant enough to add to the stock of knowledge. And given that we're working in the field of business and management, also indicate why it is important not just to academics, but also to the wider society. And then finally, there is rhetoric. Is the literature written in a coherent structure, in a clear structure? Some of that is personal and people will have personal preferences, but a lot of it you will learn clearly during your studies and you will refine your skills in doing this. So we've covered quite a lot in this session, but what if you still have questions? Well, obviously, first of all, come to the live session and we'll go through your questions one by one. But if you want to have more written guidance, there are lots of books available that have specific literature review chapters. There are research guides like Research Methods for Business Students, Designing and Managing a Research Project. All of them have a separate chapter on a literature review. So find your favorite research guide and just study the chapter on literature review. There are also whole books on doing a literature review, and two I've listed here are particularly good examples. But what I want to emphasize most of all is whatever your subject area, whatever your prior background, do spend sufficient time on your literature review because it's really the foundation of everything else. And in that process, don't hesitate to ask library staff for help. They are there for you, and librarians are often delighted to help PhD students because don't forget, many librarians have PhDs themselves. And most of the time, they have to deal with really dumb questions by undergraduate students. So they are delighted to help a PhD student find their way through the maze of information. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this session. And I look forward to seeing you in the live session with all of your questions ready. Till then.